one of the keys to the success of the story, is we didn't pump a lot of time into figuring out who the Master Chief was and why he was a ghost in the shell. We thought he is a husk. He's a big green suit of armor that you move around.
There's something good about having the Master Chief essentially be a blank slate. That helps each individual person connect to the character.
Halo is one of the most recognizable franchises of the 2000s. They're the games that Microsoft tied to both the original Xbox and the Xbox 360. It was their console seller. Each game in Bungie's iconic series offered something unique. Halo Combat Evolved popularized the LAN party and first-person shooters for consoles. Before Halo, we had N64 games with unintuitive, imprecise control schemes. Health pickups were standard, and console multiplayer meant 4 people at most. Halo revolutionized the first-person shooter design with its energy shield system, dual-stick control scheme, and the limitation of only carrying 2 weapons. Halo 2 was the game that sold the most on the original Xbox, the biggest Xbox Live game for years, and it had such an active community that it was being played well into the Xbox 360's lifecycle, even after Halo 3 had launched. Looking back on the Halo franchise, people mostly think about the multiplayer elements, the LAN parties, the primitive matchmaking of Halo 2 and the button combinations, Halo 3's custom games, and Halo Reach's endless unique maps even on Forge World. But unlike other franchises like Call of Duty and Titanfall, where multiplayer was the focus with a campaign as a bonus, Halo was not just known for multiplayer. Halo's campaign was important, and it created one of gaming's most iconic characters, the Master Chief, a big green suit of armor that rarely spoke, but could mow down endless waves of enemies. But who is the Master Chief, and why do gamers care about him? What made him memorable, and why is he still iconic 13 years past Bungie leaving him? Why does Master Chief work as a character, and what can that tell us about narrative design in video games? Doom's narrative is incredibly simple like Mario's, but there is a different goal. Mario's to save the princess. Doom Guy's is to kill until he can get to the level's exit. Doom's story is demons are loose on Mars, you are the only space marine left, go kill them all. With this being the setup, Doom Guy's character does not matter. Doom Guy is a blank slate because the story wasn't what was important to the developers. They just wanted to create a scenario in which you fight fantastical creatures with wacky firearms and make that incredibly fun. The game feel, varied encounters, and level design were the important parts. The shooting is the interesting and fun part, not the story they were telling. All the story needed to do was give the premise and let the player experience the mechanics. Doom is angry and flippant, but ultimately in Doom, the story doesn't matter. A cinematic narrative would get in the way of satisfying fast combat, which is why it's not there. With that emphasis on combat and not on narrative, there was no point to focus on character. The little need for defined character, along with the de-emphasis on narrative, is why FPS protagonists tend to be thin. Which is where we get first-person shooter protagonists as empty characters, but the FPS genre is unique in that the perspective of the character changes a lot. First-person shooters are different in that they are from the perspective of the character you are playing as. Unlike other genres, the perspective implies the player and the main character are one and the same. Compare it to something like an action game, where the player is controlling the character on the screen. You play as Sora, Ellie, Snake, but you are not them. While you do control them, there is a wall between you and the character. These games can be more cinematic because the characters have arcs that are separate from the player, because the character is separate from the player. But in first-person shooters, the view and the camera heavily imply that you are the main character. The FPS genre works best when the protagonist and player feel like the same person. It helps with immersion when the player can get lost in the world. When Master Chief or Doom Guy or Gordon Freeman feel like you is when the first-person shooter genre immerses you best. When the other characters call out Chief and you respond is when you are most involved in the game's world. Which brings us to something the player has in common with the Master Chief. They both have little agency over the story. Chief has no agency, just like the player. He never makes any decisions in the narrative of the game. He is making the same decision as the player in that the player has decided to put their disc in Halo and they want to play. The player is giving a challenge and they say yes to it, and they decide to solve it. Chief is given a mission in the game and he decides to complete it. This is very different from the character getting a challenge that the player cannot engage with. In Halo, Master Chief's mission is to kill all enemies on the way to the end of the mission. This is something the player can do. The only interaction the player can have with the game is to jump, shoot, throw grenades, get into vehicles, throw switches, and melee. Chief doesn't make big tactical decisions. He's not emotionally involved with much of anything except for Cortana. The narrative is mostly the UNSC tell Chief to go blow something up, and then he does. There is a lot of dialogue over the radio in Halo, but it is never characterized with Chief. Let's take a look at the first mission of Halo 3, Sierra 117. The dialogue here is either informational, where the player is given details about upcoming events,
See how they bait their trap? I will help you spring it.
Bravo team, this is Johnson. We got him. Fall back to the extraction point. Over. Roger that. Reynolds out. Pelicans are en route, Chief, but I can't raise Bravo. You find them, get them to the extraction point.
but mostly it is telling the player exactly what they need to do.
The river. Hurry!
Sleepers! Take them out. Nice and quiet.
The Banshees will return. Hurry! Back into the jungle.
Chief, Pelicans are at the river. We got company, so hustle up.
This isn't as fun as it looks. Cut the power.
This connects him to the player because they are both doing the same thing. The UNSC is to Chief as Bungie is to the player, handing down missions to be completed through gunning enemies down. The lack of agency of Master Chief is important because it allows the player to identify more with Chief, as they are in similar positions, and it allows him to not have goals or wants, meaning the player can identify with him more clearly because there isn't all that much there to begin with. And this is why Chief has a hard time identifying as his own character. Halo has never been Shakespeare, but the Arbiter, Sergeant Johnson, the Prophets all have varying degrees of character to them. They have goals, wants, needs. Closest thing Chief gets to it is his relationship to Cortana, which is brought up in Halo 2, fleshed out more in Halo 3, which is one of the reasons why the mission Cortana in Halo 3 is one of the worst missions. What does Chief need? Doesn't matter. What does Chief want? His goals aren't ever stated. Chief isn't wanting to save the galaxy so he can chase his true dream of being an Italian chef. It is unimportant what Chief wants because he isn't a fleshed out character. He is a vessel for the player. It is the reason that he doesn't have a face. Head to toe he's covered in sci-fi armor. He is a mostly silent protagonist speaking only in cutscene. Bungie themselves have stated they want Chief to be a ghost in the shell. A lot of this also lines up with the rookie from ODST, which doesn't talk at all and is also faceless. And it applies to the Guardians in Destiny 1 and 2. Bungie intentionally creates protagonists that have little to no character, with no face, so that the player can slot into them and see themselves in the protagonist. Master Chief isn't really a character in the Bungie games, because he doesn't have to be, and it's better if he isn't. In Doom-style first-person shooters, protagonists are vessels for the player. They are not three-dimensional characters because that would get in the way of experiencing level design and the combat encounters. In other words, the narrative serves the gameplay here, which is why focusing on the narrative would hurt the experience. Cortana is such a bad mission for the constant interrupts of the story, plus overall annoying enemies. Halo normally has a cutscene at the beginning of the mission, one at the end, some in-game dialogue to explain what is happening in the mission. It's a modern version of the Doom story. Give context for the gameplay and get out of the way so gameplay can happen, and allow it to be skipped if the player wants. Cortana, though, keeps cutting the story into the mission with multiple Gravemind and Cortana scenes in the mission, where the gameplay is stopped and you are forced to listen to vague, loud nonsense with no way to skip.
Child of my enemy, why have you come? I offer no forgiveness. A father's sins pass to his son.
The fun of Halo comes from clearing waves of Covenant or Flood with whatever tools you are given to by the level designers. So when the narrative comes in and is now the focus, it hurts engagement because the player was never playing to satisfy the narrative to begin with. What were they playing for? That 30 seconds.
In Halo 1, there was maybe 30 seconds of fun that happened over and over and over and over again. So if you can get 30 seconds of fun, you can pretty much stretch that out to be an entire game. encountering a bunch of guys, melee attacking one of them before they were aware, throwing a grenade into a group of other guys, and then cleaning up the stragglers before they could surround you. And so you can have all the great graphics and all the different characters and lots of different weapons with amazing effects, but if you don't nail that 30 seconds, you're not going to have a great game.
Why is it okay for Chief to be bland but not others? Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't get in the way of the fun you have while playing the game. Video games are a unique genre, and you need to approach characters differently than in film or in literature. You could give Chief a deep backstory with a want and a need, but it would hurt the game because ultimately Halo isn't about the narrative. The story gives the gameplay context, but it is about the level design, the new weapons, the different enemy configurations, and getting that 30 seconds of fun. The player doesn't want to move forward in Halo because they're advancing the plot. They're doing it because defeating enemies is rewarding and they want to see what the next level will have in it. The game is challenging and it's exciting to clear a room of enemies and then move to the next one. The way the game feels is why the game works, not the story pieces given in dialogue or cutscene. The story is fun, but the story in itself isn't what makes Halo enjoyable. It's the combat loop and the weapon sandbox that stay memorable, not the individual story beats of it. It's the challenging but fun moments in co-op. It's the Warthog runs, the sniping missions, the flood rushes, the sounds, the score. The story works to enhance the gameplay, and that's what makes Halo an amazing video game. Master Chief is a static character and does nothing but follow commands, but that's exactly who he needed to be to get the game to work.
Armada obliterated and the flood. We had no choice. Halo, it's finished.
No, I think we're just getting started.
Alert. I'm detecting Covenant movement.